Okay, I'm back. I'm not very good about multitasking when I'm on Zoom, so I apologize, but hopefully you got it, Meg, and you can put it in the chat. I don't know why all of a sudden I can't put it in the chat. You just gotta love Zoom. But at any rate, let me go ahead and pull back up or pull up my PowerPoint so we can talk about kind of continuing this theme of how do we do diversity, equity, inclusion work using emotional intelligence. And so I'm kind of calling this kind of a follow-up session, developing effective DEI leaders and effective DEI teams, building agency and accountability. And I'll tell you just a couple of quick reasons why I think this is so important. I worked with a college at the University of Minnesota to help them develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, which was really wonderful. It was very successful. We launched the plan. I was kind of done with the work. And then about a year later, they came back to me and they said, "Hey, Ann, would you be willing to do a workshop for us? Because we're finding that as we move this work forward and we have a lot of committed people, we're also coming up with there's still bias that happens in our teams. There's still microaggressions. Sometimes team members are challenging to work with, and we just feel like we need a little more work on how do we work together." And so part of what you're going to see today are some things that I developed for them around the notion of accountability, because we kind of think, well, once we get people on the same page and the idea that, well, we need to focus on anti-racism, we need to focus on disability justice, right? Thinking about your last presenter that I was just listening to the tail end of, once we're on the same page, everything will go smoothly. And unfortunately, it doesn't always happen that way. We're still going to we might have conflict around strategy, we might have personality conflicts. So we need to address that. And the other piece I want to talk about is agency, which I think is really central. I mean, in some ways it's a kind of nebulous word. What do we mean by agency? And it just really means to feel empowered to kind of live your truth and speak your truth and do what you need to do. And I'll tell a story that kind of highlights why I focus on that as well as accountability. I was asked by a small nonprofit out east who do really phenomenal work. I mean, really social justice kinds of work. And they had a bullying situation. They had an executive director at the very top who's male, who was not the bully, but they had someone who was kind of next to this executive director, another man, overseeing for the most part a lot of women, some younger, some white women, some women of color. And this white man, who was kind of second in command, if you will, could really be a bully. I mean, there was no question about it. It was overwhelming that a lot of people in the organization thought that. They'd done kind of, the executive director had worked with him. Suffice it to say, they kind of brought me in to do some workshops, and I could tell they kind of wanted me to fix it, right? And part of what I decided to do was to really focus on agency, on empowering everyone in that organization to see that they had the ability to affect change. That yes, it would help if the executive director would fix it, and for whatever complex reason he could, he wasn't willing to let this guy go, et cetera. This was, but it wasn't going to get fixed from the top down. So I was really interested in how do we build grassroots, right? How do we build power from the grassroots, kind of from empowering everyone? And one of the things I talked to them about was there's this one particular woman, this is common with bullies, a woman in kind of a mid-level position who he would really pick on, right? Or he wouldn't, all the bullying, he wouldn't give her information, he'd leave her out of the loop, that kind of thing. And I would talk to these staff who would say, yeah, we would see him do it in a meeting. And I said to them, what would happen if the 5 of you who witnessed what he did to this woman, if the 5 of you called him out in that meeting, do you think he'd keep doing it? But I think part of what happens, a couple things. One is we see a bully and we think, well, I'm glad it's not me. Unfortunately, that happens. But the other piece is we look up and we think, well, someone up there is going to fix it, meaning someone, a supervisor, someone higher than my pay grade. The fact is that doesn't always happen. And we can actually change things by kind of speaking our truth, as I said, holding people accountable, and being agents in whatever power we actually have. So those are just 2 stories about why I think it's important to think about building agency and accountability. So what are we going to do today? We're going to start actually with a small group discussion. I think we did last time. I can't remember. Yes, I can't even remember yesterday. Sorry. But we're going to start in with I know I talked about challenges a little bit. No, we didn't start because we went into emotional intelligence yesterday. But I'm going to start with that same topic of challenges for diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders. and have you kind of identify what are your challenges. Then we'll just have a couple slides to review emotional intelligence, just in case there's someone here who wasn't here yesterday. And then I want to talk about agency and accountability and what it means to develop ourselves and our teams, another small group discussion around those topics, then another scenario and next steps. So that's what we're going to do. So I want you to consider the challenges that people who are leading and moving DEI efforts often face. And so somewhat similar to what I talked about yesterday, having limited time and limited resources, money and staffing. Why do I say that? Because when you're talking about trying to override or overcome or address systems of oppression, there's never going to be enough time and resources because we still have to do our other work. And so it can become challenging to know you want to do certain things and not have the time and resources. That means you have to prioritize. It means you have to sometimes say no and set boundaries. That can be very hard. Size and complexity of changes we want to make. I mean, in this case, I was talking about the tenure code in higher ed. I think I mentioned yesterday that it might be a public policy or procedure in your organization. Maybe you work for a healthcare organization and you have certain policies around things that would be ideal to change, but might have to go through a number of different committees, and it might be challenging. Managing expectations of multiple stakeholders. So different people want different things and you have to manage that. And some might be louder than others, but you have to kind of prioritize and think about that. Navigating internal, external barriers. Again, the way of doing things in a department, at your college or university, or at your organization. Setting personal boundaries in order to avoid burnout. Managing bias, conflict, and challenging personalities on our teams. This is the stuff that they found out after they'd had this great strategic plan in this college, was realizing that, okay, now we've got to put it into practice, and now we're running into bias and conflict and personalities. And then finally, building sustainability into our efforts and developing future leaders. So how can I set limits to what I can do, keep moving the efforts forward, but always with an eye to kind of who's behind me, who's coming up that I can help develop as a leader, so that when it works for me to take a break from this work, because you might need to take a break because it's just challenging and traumatizing and difficult. You might need to take a break because you took a different position. You might just decide that it doesn't work for you to do this DEI work right now. Whatever that is, you don't want to just leave a kind of gap, a space where you were, if at all possible. You want to fill that with other people. So all of these are things that can be challenging for you. So I'm going to put you into a small group and ask you to talk about these questions. So thanks to Meg for being able to put that document into the chat so you see these questions. What challenges have you faced as you move diversity, equity, inclusion work forward? And I don't expect that all of you are on a committee, that all of you are doing this formally. I think being a DEI ally, advocate, champion, whatever word you use, can just be the person who says, hey, can we take a minute in this program and think about who our main users are, and are we really reaching the people we need to reach? That's actually DEI work. So whatever works for you, and when I say that phrase, as you move your DEI work forward, what strategies and actions have helped you navigate these challenges? And where could you use more help? What challenges are most responsible for slowing down the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you're part of or that you see happening in your workplace? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. And what we realized yesterday was that not everyone goes into the breakout rooms. So I'm going to make the breakout rooms kind of large in case there are some people who don't show up. And I might move you around if, we had like a couple people who were by themselves in a breakout room, which clearly doesn't work. So I'm going to give you about 12 minutes to have this conversation. You'll see the little timer like yesterday, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning when there's 2 minutes. And so please unmute yourselves and also take your cameras off. I think I heard at some point that someone said that like there was a whole room with no cameras on, and I think that can make it very challenging to feel like you're having conversations. So please take your camera off if you feel like you can, and I'll go ahead and open up the rooms. Great. So apologies if there were folks who didn't have access to the questions. I'm sorry about that. I don't know why Zoom didn't want to let me put something in the chat when it did. It let me do it yesterday, but it It's being fickle. And so one thing we want to make sure you do is to go into the chat now and see the document that Meg has shared, and make sure that you can get into that document so that the next time you're in a small group, you'll see the questions. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or any trouble getting into that document, but Meg has put it in there. So what happens, I think, is once you get, okay, so Jacqueline's not seeing it.
I'll add it one more time.
Yeah. Yeah, Zoom is very annoying that if you're not kind of in the room when it gets added and then you come in later, you can't access it. I just don't know why that happens. So it looks like, okay. Yeah, so hopefully you can go into the chat, click on that document, and you'll see the questions. And there'll also be a scenario. So apologies for the challenges with that for people.
No worries.
Hopefully
it just blew a circuit.
What? It just blew a circuit.
No worries. It just blew a circuit.
Exactly. Okay. Well, so I ask you to think about, you know, what might be challenges to bringing this lens to the work that you do, to talking about anti-racism and race, sexual orientation, disability, gender, sexism. For anyone who is trying to kind of move those issues forward, have you run into any challenges?
You know, I think I'm Dolores Bertana and I'm with Neighborhood Ministries. And I think that with us in the outreach work in networking work that we do, there's the assumption that because we're neighborhood ministries, that everything that we do is going to end up being based on religion.
Right.
And while we are a very faithful community, the services that are provided are not, you know, of course, you know, we may start off with a prayer, you know, at the beginning, or, you know, something simple like that. But in the community, there's the perception that, you know, it's really about trying to teach religion, which is far from the truth.
Right. Thanks, Dolores. Yeah, so sometimes one of the things that can get in the way of our work is just dealing with assumptions people make and misinformation. And so recognizing that how we communicate about our work is really important. I can't tell you how many people say things like, oh, I never knew we were doing this work. I didn't know there was this committee. I didn't know anybody was attempting to do this. Because people sometimes do amazing things, but don't communicate about it as well as they could. Or recognizing that you need to communicate things in multiple ways, right? Not everyone's going to read emails. Not everyone's going to read the page of a website. So how can we kind of get the word out about who we are, what we really do, what we don't do, what are the misconceptions? Yeah. Thanks, Dolores. Someone else want to share a challenge that they've run into? Gatekeepers. Meg, you want to say more about that?
I didn't participate in a group, but I feel in this work, there's often people who talk the talk, but don't necessarily walk the walk.
Right. The kind of, I'm fully supportive of our efforts to diversify, but we have to consider budget, or we have to think about the discipline, or whatever, you know, there's always a but, right? I'm just looking at the chat. That came up in our group. Elizabeth said this as well, right? Pretty much, it's not going to be okay to say I don't support diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in 2021 in most organizations. But trust me, there's plenty of ways not to support it while you're still saying you support it, right, Meg? Just what you're, and Elizabeth, what you're talking about. So I even had someone once say to me, oh yeah, I feel like they put all the people into the diversity committee that they think won't actually create change, right? That you know, they know how to make a group that isn't actually going to push anything forward.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know if that was the case. It was the perception of some people on the committee, that they almost just kind of unloaded certain staff there that they thought were not particularly effective. But one thing that's true is it's going to be harder for that gatekeeper to keep that gate, if you will, to like make sure things don't change. The more people are knocking at the gate, the more people are bringing it up, the more allies they are saying, okay, yeah, I know we've done it this way for the last however many years. It's not working. We're not getting the results we need. We have to change things. So I just had a conversation with a colleague who was saying, why can't we go into an organization and tell them, look, here's some data that shows that you have some challenges with some of your marginalized staff members, and just tell them that it's like IT, right? If an IT consultant came in and said, your system is broken, here's how you fix it, they would just probably fix it. And I said, yeah, it's never going to be like that, I don't think, because this is so much about identity and psychology and emotion, right? When we say it isn't working, and we say we have all white male leadership or we have all white leadership, and that's a problem, a lot of white leaders are going to say, what, I'm a problem? Why am I a problem? Haven't we been doing good things, right? So now, boom, we're in the psychological, emotional kind of identity realm of, yeah, you're still a good person and you still have privilege, and our programs aren't functioning the way that they should. So I don't think it's ever going to be as simple as IT, much as that would be nice. Just looking in the chat. Oh, and here's one from Delaney. I think those that enter this field, oh, I apologize. This was a direct message. I don't want to read it out loud, so I'm sorry about that.
You're good. My internet's just being a little wonky. So I didn't want to
thanks,
cut you out.
Delaney. All of a sudden I was like, yikes, I want to respect that. Is it okay if I read it then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, good. I think those that enter this field as new workers, or even those who maybe transition positions later on, whether or not there's an actual barrier, it may cause some fear to speak up or create this idea that the new one shouldn't step on toes. If no one says anything, no change ever occurs. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That you come in, and also, and we learned that from yesterday with some people who were very vulnerable and shared that as someone who's a person of color, to suddenly bring things up could really challenge how they're perceived, right? The whole idea that, oh, you have an agenda, right? So you have this agenda, and now all of a sudden you're talking about racism or talking about, implicit bias. And if you're new, if you're in a less powerful position, all of that is risky. I've worked with a lot of faculty who are like, until I have tenure, I don't want to push things because the people I'm pushing against are going to vote on whether I get tenure. That's a tricky situation. One more reason to build as many allies and as strong a team and a community as possible, so that you can kind of have each other's backs and support each other as much as possible. Also, so important that people in leadership learn how to speak up and take risks and be vulnerable. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint and just say, as I've said before, that this work is challenging in ways that other kinds of work isn't. To that, my point about like, why can't it just be like IT? I had another person once, a woman just said to me in a training, why can't we just talk about facts, right? And she was talking about like, there are facts around racism, around sexism. Can't we just talk about facts? And I said, yeah, I think it'd be really nice if we could, but I just don't think it's that simple. I mean, sometimes go ahead, try facts and see if that'll work, right? Throw out a statistic about, the less than 5% of all tenured faculty in the United States are women of color, right? And see if that can really remind people that there are barriers. But it may be that you are also going to need more than just facts, because again, so much of this is wrapped up in starting to realize things I never had to think about. Never had to think about my gender for men, never had to think about your race as a white person, never had to really think about social class if you're middle class. And suddenly you're asking me to think about things I never had to think about before. So that gets into, issues of relationship. Yeah, please jump in.
Yes, so this is kind of a little bit off topic, but on topic. I think ageism,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, I experienced ageism in, in terms of interviewing for different positions. I felt that for most of the positions that I applied for, I was probably the most educated, most qualified, and more life experience, but I really felt that my age affected it. The other is my 24-year-old son. He just bought his first home, and he dealt with a lot of ageism.
Great.
The banks really questioned him in terms of and he's a software engineer, so he's been doing that work already for a couple of years, but they really questioned, and they had him resubmit statements after statements after statements, because they really questioned how it was that he could come
Right.
down with his down payment and everything else.
Yeah.
So I really felt that he was facing ageism.
Yeah. Thanks, Dolores. Yeah, and how sad, shouldn't we be celebrating someone who at 24 is buying a house? I mean, good for him. That's a huge milestone. And I'll just say this about ageism that I think is so interesting, where some other kind of isms, whether it's sexism or racism, have people who are kind of, if you will, kind of perceived as superior because of the stereotypes, white people, men, right? And with ageism, it's more like there's a sweet spot in the middle. So ageism, I always talk about, it tends to play out in different ways for different ends of that spectrum. So there's a particular way that ageism plays out around people who are older, right? So, I had a woman in a training who said, she had this beautiful head of white hair. And she said, I've had people look at my hair and say, oh, do you know how to use a computer? Just because it's clear I'm older, right? And she said, it's really annoying. Don't assume I can't do things just because I'm older, right? And then you have the other side. I've had numerous people who are younger. I mean, I had a young woman come up to me and she said, could we stop saying the word millennial like it's a dirty word? Like, everything is negative about millennials, as if every age group hasn't had their own, every age group bucks the age group before them, right? Baby boomers, etc. But there's this way that we talk about all the, things that millennials are ruining. Like, I don't know, I think I read about napkins, golf, and manners are all things that millennials have ruined. I'm not too worried about golf anyway, but and now it's Gen Z or Gen X. No, it's Z. Gen Z is this next generation, right? But that's an interesting thing about ageism, is that it still really does play out. And of course, all of these things are intersectional. So they play out also around racial identity and gender identity, sexual orientation, et cetera. So you take ageism coupled with LGBTQ issues. My community, I identify as lesbian, and suddenly you have this population who are older, who are queer, who are like, am I going to be able to be, and I've lived my whole life out now, right? Post Stonewall. Can I go into a assisted living facility and not be assumed to be heterosexual or not be assumed to be cisgender, right? Have you done the education you need in those facilities to realize that we are an increasingly older population? So thanks for bringing that forward, Dolores, because it is absolutely an issue that impacts people that we want to be thinking about and talking about. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. I just want to make sure that we could see Dolores while we were talking and listening to her. This was just my slide yesterday about emotional intelligence, and I want to share a new slide about a book. And I feel so badly because I went to find this slide I have in one of my presentations with a list of EQ resources, and I just could not find it. But I promise I will get that to you all. Just, I had hoped to have it today, but I don't. So this is from a book. I can't read the top of my screen for some reason, but the book is Permission to Feel, Unlocking the Power of Emotion to Help Our Kids, Ourselves, and Our Society Thrive. So Mark Brackett is a director of that Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And he does a lot of work on this idea of what it means to become an emotion scientist. So that would be definitely a reference, a slightly more academic one for you who are interested in more about emotional intelligence. But he lists these 5 skills, right? Recognizing our own emotions and those of others, not just in the things we think, feel, and say, but in facial expressions, body language, vocal tones, and other nonverbal signals. This to me is really important work, both for leadership in general, but especially for anyone who wants to lead and push forward move forward diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. It's that ability to read a room. It's that ability to recognize that people are going to have intense feelings sometimes. And so not just hearing what people say, but also paying attention to the nonverbals that they're giving you. And then understanding those. So that's recognizing, understanding those feelings and determining their source. What experiences actually cause them, and then see how they've influenced our behaviors. This also is really important for diversity, equity, inclusion work. If you think about, I think about some of the pushback I've been seeing. I've been starting to do a lot more work with senior leaders in companies, and overwhelmingly they are white men. And they know they need to do this work. They don't exactly understand it. And I think there's quite a bit of fear of like, am I going to mess up? Am I going to get it wrong? But also, where do I fit in this? Because I hear everything is about diversity. And then I kind of hear that I'm kind of the bad guy. And so it can create pushback. It can create challenges. And so part of it is understanding kind of some of that emotional experience they're having. Not that I ever want to like, I don't want to just fall into a trap of like taking care of people with a tremendous amount of privilege, but I want to move them. I want to get them to see that we're going to have a better world, a better business, a better society if we don't have discrimination and bias and trauma and hurt and the kinds of things that we see every day. And so, and you have to be a part of it. That's my message. We all have to be a part of it. So the more I can connect with them and they can hear what I'm saying because we're relating well together, I think the more I can move them. Label emotions with a nuanced vocabulary, another skill. Express our feelings in accordance with cultural norms and social context in a way that tries to inform and invites empathy from the listener. This is again where we have to always have that DEI lens that says that some people are going to be able to express feelings. For example, white people are going to be able to express anger in a way that people of color, Black people, Native people are not, because of all sorts of racist stereotypes. And so to recognize that even as we talk about emotional intelligence, not all of us have the same ability to have this full range of expressing human emotion that everyone else does. And we need to acknowledge that and push against that. And finally, regulate our emotions rather than let them regulate us by finding practical strategies for dealing with what we and others feel. So just think about the last time you were in some kind of a meeting where it got weird emotionally, right? Where you could just, someone, you know, have you ever been in a meeting where someone stormed out, where someone just stopped talking, where someone got very kind of edgy, where someone got passive aggressive, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, it derails things, right? So the ability to kind of manage that is going to be something really important as a leader. So these are some of my thoughts about agency, accountability, DEI, agency, accountability, and leadership. Before we move into I'm going to share a few things and then move us into your next small group discussion. So I think DEI work is never just intellectual. It involves emotions, identity, and relationships. And for this reason, having the best analysis or being the smartest person in the room won't be enough for leading people in DEI efforts. I'll just share a quick story. I was doing this work with this nonprofit, and we were trying to get people to fill out this survey. And we want as many staff to fill out this DEI survey as possible, right? So I asked the chair of this diversity committee to please send a reminder, a communication. And so she's very committed to this work. And the communications she sends was basically full of kind of shame. It was kind of like, well, a lot of you don't seem to care about this and you're not filling this out. And, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, this was the wrong message, right? I mean, technically it was the right message because it said fill out the survey, but the way she sent it kind of made you feel bad. And you realize that being on the right side of this issue doesn't mean that you don't still want to pay attention to how you're saying things. This work is about challenging and changing oppressive structures and systems that have been in place for centuries. So DEI leaders will always deal with pushback and resistance. Leaders model how to find agency and power and how to think and act strategically. You can do that even with a boss who doesn't care, even with leadership that is not supportive. It won't move as quickly with leadership that isn't as supportive as they could be, but it can move, even in the face of racism, misogyny, ableism, etc. DEI work will often be slow, overwhelming, and traumatic. It's hard to say that, right? Who wants to sign up for that when I say it's slow, overwhelming, and traumatic? But it's honest, right? That it is really difficult work. A DEI leader models how to take care of themselves by being realistic and setting limits, respecting their own and others' boundaries, and leaving room for emotional work. And finally, DEI leaders model how to hold each other accountable. Leaders admit their own biases and mistakes. We're all going to do it. No matter how committed we are to moving this forward, we are all going to continue to, especially in ways we have privilege to show bias. We make amends and we model how to do better. And we work to acknowledge and recognize our own privilege and actively use it in the service of equity and inclusion. So I wanted to say a couple things about accountability from Brene Brown. As I mentioned yesterday, I really like her work. And she started a podcast, and this is back in July 1st. So, you know, Memorial Day, I think it was May 25th, was the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of stuff starts to happen. And this is relatively soon after that. Brene Brown does this podcast about accountability. And some of what she's talking about is people holding her accountable as a white person for her racism, for her white privilege. So here's what she says: accountability is not comfortable. Being held accountable for racism in this case, and feeling shame is not the same thing as being shamed. I think that's really important. A really important point, that you might feel shame if somebody calls you out. It doesn't mean that you're being shamed. Why is that important? Because now we have this whole push against call out culture, right? Cancel culture, right? And this idea that like everybody's getting canceled, you can't say anything anymore, and everybody's shaming everyone else. Well, just because you feel shame doesn't mean I shamed you, right? Shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. And I love how she talks about guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad, right? Guilt is a good thing because it helps us do better in our behaviors and our actions. But shame isn't. Shame is I'm bad. And during every one of, and I think this is great because she's being really vulnerable here. During every one of the many times that I have been held accountable for not recognizing my own privilege or centering my story or my experience, every time I've experienced shame, not guilt. I didn't feel like, oh, I did something bad or these actions are not aligning with my values. My first response has always been full on shame. That feels very honest to me to hear from Brene Brown. But she goes on, it's our responsibility for experiencing and regulating our own emotions. It's my job to regulate my emotion, move through shame in a productive way, without defensiveness, without doubling down, without rationalizing, and without asking, for example, people of color to take care of me. Now that I've noticed racism, paid attention to it, realized how ubiquitous and pervasive and pernicious it is, and now I'm all upset about it, right? That's my job to take care of myself, not at the expense of people of color. And so I love what she says here. We solve the problem of accountability with action. It's what am I going to do differently? How am I going to show up differently? What different choices am I going to make moving forward? How am I going to think about the language I'm using? How am I going to think about how I'm showing up? Change or action is probably the best cure for the shame we experience around accountability. So we have to be willing and able to hold ourselves accountable, or we can't really do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so here are the questions for your next small group. What has been your experience with agency and accountability as you move DEI work forward, or even as you just think about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Are you able to speak your truth, even when it challenges the status quo? So that's the piece about agency. Are you able to sometimes push up against things when you believe they're wrong? Are you able to hold your colleagues accountable for challenging behavior, for bias and microaggressions, for disrespectful and even bullying behavior? I worked at a university where there was a guy in a department, brilliant guy, right? You know, brought in, you know, lots of grant money, and he was a brilliant faculty member. And the one staff person who worked with him, it was a revolving door. They never lasted more than probably 6 months because he was such a bully. And I kept thinking, I don't care how brilliant you are. How is it that you can continue to treat people really poorly and stay in your job, right? And you have to wonder how many people look the other way, not just bystanders, but really this notion of being a reinforcer. How many people reinforced his behavior by not calling him out on it? So are you able to hold your colleagues accountable? If so, what did that look like? And if not, why not? And have you been held accountable by your colleagues? How did that go? How do you hold yourself accountable? How do you give your colleagues permission to hold you accountable, right? So there's a lot of questions here. So it's really important to me that you have access to them. So please make sure, if you haven't already, to go up into the chat now before I put you in small groups and download that document that Meg was kind enough to put in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and change the breakout rooms a little bit and give you another 12 minutes to have that conversation about agency and accountability. So I hope that you can turn on your camera and that you can have a conversation. Great, I think everyone's zooming back in now. Welcome back. I hope you had good conversations. I'm curious if anyone's willing to share anything about, especially this idea of like holding yourself accountable, holding others accountable, letting other people know that you're okay to be held accountable. Did any of that resonate with you all? What did you talk about?
I want to speak on that because that was a good topic. Being able to be real with yourself. If you're real with yourself, you're going to be real with others. And I shared my experience with a supervisor from a previous agency that I worked for, and having to go through the grievance process, having to do the discrimination lawsuit, and how far out it was drawn. And I left in the middle of the process and then had to go back for the hearing, and it went in my favor. However, I've moved on and now I'm a supervisor. So I have to look at myself and think back to that experience. Like, do I want to cause other people that hardship? Do I want other people to look at me that way? I'm genuinely a sweet, helpful individual. Like, I want to help everybody. I want everybody to be okay. I often say it's a social worker in me, but it's just who I am personally. So yeah, I do. I give my team opportunities to say, you messed up. I look at myself at the end of the day and say, hey, did you do the right thing? Did you say the right thing? Did you think before you spoke on that thing? And if I didn't, I'm not bigger than an apology. I don't mind saying, hey, I messed up. Can you please forgive me? And genuinely mean that and not do that behavior again. So yeah, I love that holding yourself accountable piece of everything.
Yeah. Thanks, Chiquita. Thanks so much for sharing. And I'm sorry that that was your experience of having to, I'm glad it went in your favor. And thanks for sharing, I mean, the kind of, maybe the irony or the sadness is that it's having a supervisor like you that's going to make people want to stay, make people want to work harder, make people want to feel connected to your work. That's the irony, is that we think, we have this model of leadership as being about being definitive and assertive and always knowing exactly what's right. And to hear Chiquita say, I'm not beyond saying I made a mistake, that's huge. And it's not been our model of leadership. And that's a huge problem. So yeah, thank you for modeling that. And we know that. I'm working with faculty all the time saying, I may have said this yesterday, like, you need to model vulnerability in the classroom, which is not what most faculty are taught. You need to model expertise, right? And that I know what I'm talking about. Well, if you're a white faculty member addressing racism, actually, you don't know exactly what you're talking about. There's some things you'll never know what the lived experience of a BIPOC person is. So you're going to have to get over that and recognize that you're modeling not knowing, modeling holding yourself and others accountable. And again, that's actually what makes students feel connected to you. It's what makes our supervisees feel connected to us. When we do say, oh, I did mess up, I didn't get that, thank you. Oh, you're making me a better supervisor, you're making me a better person, right? But that's not always encouraged. So thanks for starting us off. Someone else, what resonated? What did you talk about?
We talked a lot of kind of like the undertone of the theme was safety, where if we didn't feel safe to either hold somebody accountable, to speak up, whether we had agency, things like that, like whether our job was going to be at risk or whether things were going to happen, it kind of, the underlying theme was like it wasn't safety, there was unsure, there was a feeling of like uncertainty if you were to potentially speak up. So kind of went back to that, the safety.
Right. Yep. Thanks, Jacqueline. And I never want to say this out of a context of power. As I said yesterday, there's always power in any workplace situation. In any institution, there's power, whether it's higher ed, whether it's a state agency, whether it's, you know, whatever it is, a nonprofit, there's still power. So, and we get to recognize how for some people, it, you know, we might have really important reasons why we can't take certain risks, and why some things, there isn't the kind of safety that we need in order to challenge things. And that's why I talk a lot about wanting people with some degree of privilege to be willing to take some risks. And I can't make that judgment call for anybody, but I've worked with a lot of white people who don't push other white people about racism. I've worked with a lot of heterosexual and cisgender people who don't push other heterosexual and cisgender people around LGBTQ inclusion. I've seen a lot of men who don't push other men around sexism and misogyny and how it plays out. And when you have privilege, you can take more risks. I think that's really true. It doesn't mean in every situation you can or you should, but pushing yourself to think about that. Are there places where I think I might be unsafe, or is that just fear? And, you know, having those tough conversations.
One of the things that we mentioned was the Trump, you know, and how as a society, country, that we, since the 60s, what steps had we taken and where were we at really? Because I think, you know, at least in my opinion, he brought that underground layer to the top. And in my opinion, society-wide, you know, from the steps that we have made forward, there's definitely steps that we're now taken back. And so then how do we, I hate to use the word heal, but, you know, reconcile, or how do we get to a healthier place? I guess that's a better word. How do we get to a healthier place where we can continue the movement forward?
Right, right. Thanks, Dolores. Yeah, and if the presidency of Donald Trump taught us anything, it's that we shouldn't take anything for granted. That certain things that we assumed, maybe, I mean, just take the Voting Rights Act for an example, right? That our voting rights are intact, that there will be no effort to roll them back, as there have been for so many years, especially targeting communities of color in the African American community. And now we're seeing it happen again. So to recognize that there's a kind of vigilance, a kind of, you know, and that's again the emotional intelligence, because we need to stay sustained in this fight, if you will, in this movement toward social justice, because there isn't really a time to rest, and yet we don't want to burn out. So taking it seriously is really important work. I'm gonna go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint, because I want to put you in this very last exercise, which is the scenario. So I'm gonna read it out loud, and this is a mix of kind of DEI and leadership and emotional intelligence, and then ask you to put you back in small groups and have a conversation. So again, as I did yesterday, like, make this work for you. If you work in higher education, you can have it be faculty and staff. If you work in an agency, it can be staff and administrators, whatever is your context. But you're working with a group of committed staff to move DEI efforts forward in your unit or department. You're co-chairing this effort with Trey, who is a relatively new staff member. Trey's open about identifying as non-binary and routinely shares that they use they, them pronouns. In the last couple meetings, you've noticed that Louise, a more senior staff member who has been in your unit or department for many years, tends to dominate discussion. Louise is very passionate about DEI, but she's also new to some of the concepts and discussions. In this meeting, you notice that Louise also repeatedly refers to Trey as he. At one point in the meeting, you say, I'd just like to remind everyone to please notice the pronouns we're using to make sure they match what we share at the beginning of each meeting. And let's also make sure to leave space for everyone to share. Later, you're talking about something unrelated with Dylan, who's part of the DEI committee. Dylan says, by the way, I think Louise felt hurt by the way you kind of called her out in the last meeting. She told me she felt targeted by you. And she said Trey wasn't even upset about her using the wrong pronoun. So here you've got some kind of issues around DEI, and you've got some triangulation going on. You've got some emotional pieces, right? So, I apologize. Let me pull that up. Here are your questions that I wanted you to answer, which are also in the chat. What would leadership for you look like in this situation? How would you respond to Dylan? Because he's kind of brought it up to you, or they have. Would you say anything to Louise? Why or why not? Would you pull Trey into any of this? Why or why not? And how might your own social identities like race, gender identity, et cetera, as well as your own role in your unit, your department, your school or organization affect what you would say and how you would react? So again, Dylan just brings this up, kind of triangulates you into this. Trey's involved, Louise is involved, Dylan's involved. What should you say? I'll go ahead. I'm going to put you into some groups. And I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to have this conversation, then we'll pull out and talk about it. We are going to go till about 1:10, which still should give everyone a chance for a little bit of a break.
Or if you're here, 11:10. If you're in
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Yeah.
No worries.
Thank you.
You know, across the country, so it's totally fine.
Yeah, no. Thank you for that. Yes. 11:10. Yeah, just Minneapolis centric. What can I say? So, you know, I created this scenario because it should be relatively simple. You're having a meeting, you decide to share some things, reframe, you know, I just remind people about some best practices for working together. And yet it never kind of it doesn't always work out the way we want it to, right? People are complex and psychological and emotional, and things like this are going to happen. I was in a small committee once in higher ed with a whole group of undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty, staff, people of color, white people, queer people, right? And the one white male faculty member completely dominated the conversation. And I just kept thinking, if this is happening in a diversity committee, right? And I tried to kind of gently remind people to have other people, you know, let's get other voices in the room. This stuff's going to happen. So what did you talk about? What might you do with these characters I gave you? Louise is my mother-in-law. Dylan is my oldest, my son. I don't know anyone named Trey, but just use that name for whatever reason. What would you do?
Well, and I don't want to speak for our group, you know, as a whole, but we had a lot of conversation around, we're really not, you know, fully educated on the whole pronouns thing.
Right.
And so are there guidelines? So anyway, so I think the voice was kind of, it you know, we really didn't know because we really don't understand about the pronouns. And so, you know, and then, but it was brought up that there's a safe zone on the internet where there's different videos and different resources. So we're talking about, you know, what are the guidelines in regards to appropriate use and when and why and how and so we were kind of not knowing. It's
right,
like,
made it challenging to answer, to talk about it a little bit. Yeah. In general, it's becoming more and more best practice to give opportunities for people to share their pronouns, but not expect it. Some people might want to not share pronouns. Some people don't use pronouns. You'll notice I put mine and others have as well on their Zoom. I'm pointing to it like you can see it, but it's my Zoom name, right? She, her. I have it on my email signature. That's becoming best practice. One of the things I wanted to note in the scenario is it would not be necessarily best practice to call Trey out in that meeting and say, Louise, you misgendered Trey, right? But to point out that there was some misgendering going on in a generic way and to remind people that, you know, what we had done is gone around, and this is also best practice, to introduce yourself. And if you're comfortable sharing your pronoun, and be careful, because if you do it in a room filled with people who have never heard of this before, it can be challenging. I'll just tell you a quick story. I watched as someone did this in a room with people who were neighborhood activists, and I don't like to swear, but this is exactly what happened. This woman had never been asked this question before to share her pronouns. So she said, well, I don't know. You can call me anything you want, a she, a he, I'm an it. I guess I'm a shit. That's literally what she said. And that is not, and I don't, you can't exactly get mad at her because she didn't really know what the point of the whole thing was. There was no education before that this is an important part of people's identities and that this is about people who might identify as non-binary, trans, or have their gender, how they share their gender misread by people. She didn't know what to do. But of course, it sends a horrible message that it's like a joke. So best practices, make sure that you do some education and that people know why you might be doing this. But part of what I wanted to show in the scenario is like, what Louise goes to is, oh, Trey wasn't even bothered, right? Two things. One, Trey may have a lot of reasons to not tell Louise they were bothered, right? Including power. And two, it doesn't really matter whether an individual person, because we hear that all the, oh, I told this joke, but Jim doesn't matter that I told a gay joke. He's gay and he doesn't care. No, that's not the reason we don't tell gay jokes, because your one gay friend is okay with it. We don't tell them because it creates an exclusive and discriminatory culture. And the same thing here. Well, whatever Trey might have said to Louise, I did that for inclusion. But also you might want to remind Dylan, that's not really Dylan's business to talk to you about Louise, is it? This is the emotional, is it, Anaid? I can see your face like you're kind of either watching a really funny show somewhere else or you're responding to what I'm saying. Do you want to say anything?
I just want, because we were talking about a lot of those things. Someone in my group said that one of their first reactions would be to tell Louise to stay out of it. Not Louise, Dylan.
Dylan, right.
And then what you were saying before about doesn't matter what Trey said, or what Louise thought that Trey thought. It's
right.
Showing respect to people.
Exactly.
And yeah, it doesn't. And how did she know? Like, did she ask him?
Right.
She asked Trey if they were okay with it. Like, did she just step, and
right. And then would Trey have even felt?
And Trey may not feel comfortable telling her the truth. Yeah. So
exactly.
I was with all of what
right.
you
right. So that whole boundary thing, right? So this is an example of, I've got to set some boundaries with Dylan, right? And also with Louise, I mean, Louise, maybe you'll go and check in and say, hey, Louise, I just want to check in how we're doing about that meeting, or maybe not, depending on what you feel like doing. Definitely checking in with Trey as your co-chair, I think is a good idea, just to say, how are you feeling about how the meetings are going? But also to let Dylan know that that's, I don't know that I'd say like stay out of it, but that, that's also, you get to figure out how to do it in the style that works for you. But people are gonna sometimes triangulate, do things like that can get in the way of trying to function. And also, not everyone's gonna love everything a leader does or says, so you get to hold on to that, right? What if Louise leaves in a huff, right? Could happen. And then you could check in with Louise, but say, hey, I just, if I would encourage you to have a conversation with me if there's anything I'm doing that's challenging for you, Louise, right? Modeling that we can have hard conversations. We can have a lot of emotion in this room. That's okay. That's not a bad thing, but we'll do it with respect and with boundaries and in ways that move things forward and that are inclusive, right? Other comments about this, or, I mean, my last slide, and I won't put it up just for time's sake. My last slide was like, did anything resonate for you in this session? Anything you're thinking about taking away?
I'm just happy that you explained the pronoun portion of it, because sometimes we're uneducated about something. We can say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I shared in our group, I actually said I would thank Dylan for bringing it to my attention. That's just the person I am. And I would have conversation with Louise. I wouldn't have brought Trey into any of the conversation, but I want to check on him. How are you feeling? Tell me, you know, what you thought. So I brought up the conversation about my cousin. And I love to talk about him because, again, he's my little baby, and now he's this grown woman. And when we're talking, I may say, boy, and he goes, no, girl, remember, you told me that I could be this girl, and I did. I helped him get to where he is today.
Oh.
And he's educated me a whole lot. And I can't remember the girl's name in the group, Elizabeth. She said, I was saying when I respond to him on social media, he's beautiful. And I may say, girl, you got it going on, or, ooh, honey, you look good, or something like that. It's easy because I'm thinking. And he's not right there in my face. And we would joke and laugh about me still calling him a boy. And I could respond on social media totally different because that's who he relates to. But I had to remind him, you were my baby boy. Now you are my grown woman.
Right.
But the education piece is needed. We need more education.
Yeah. Thanks, Chiquita. And how wonderful that you're so supportive, because for so many folks who are trans and non-binary, you know, just do not get support at all. So that's huge. It's huge and it's wonderful. And yeah, you know, you're shifting. I have a friend who's now has a daughter who had a son, and it can, especially when my friend goes back to her child's childhood, it can be very hard. You know, she says now with my daughter, you know, as a grown woman, it's no problem with the pronouns, but it gets challenging. And so recognizing that, yeah, that's part of everybody's growth, and how can we do that in a way that is loving and supportive, and still recognizing at the center of all of this is wanting to support. I mean, I think I may have mentioned what happened in Arkansas and how horrific that is, and that we're in this battle for recognizing that people get to live into their gender identity, and that this is absolutely an issue of public health and health care. When we think about the tremendous challenges that trans and non-binary folks face. So yeah, and thanks for pointing out that, like, you don't know what you don't know. So yeah, how can I create education? How can I go back to my unit or my department and say, hey, could we have a lunch and learn for an hour and watch a video? Or because there's amazing stuff that's out there that allows people to learn about transgender identity, non-binary identity, LGBTQ issues, pronouns, all that good stuff. So it's 11:09 for you all. I just want to thank you for having me again. I hope it was helpful. I appreciate all the sharing that you did, both in small groups and in large groups. Thanks as always to Meg for bringing me in. I always appreciate an opportunity to talk to people who are making a difference in the world like you are. So thanks. My PowerPoint is something that I will share with Meg, and I promise to get you the resources for emotional intelligence tools. There's some great things on the web that you can access, so I'll send that as well.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you everyone for your active participation these past couple of days in these, you know, difficult conversation sessions. So we really appreciate the vulnerability that you've opened yourself up to by participating. And as Anne said, she will be sharing documents with us. And just so everyone knows, we're building a Google Drive to be able to share everything from the meeting from the 2 days with you so that you can have access to those. So we did build in a 20-minute break. We thought everybody would need some time to sort of, you know, reflect on what we've talked about so far today and to prepare for the next session. So please take a 20-minute break and come back at 11:30 Arizona time sharp. And thanks again to Anne.
You're welcome.
Bye.